Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you to China Matters for inviting me to speak tonight. I too would like to acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Gadigal people over which sovereignty has never been ceded. Now, the first question that I've been asked to answer is, how do I see China? I sat there going, oh my God, there's so many ways in which I see China. But I think the simplest answer to the question is as a multiverse, a place of diverse and overlapping worlds held together by the glue of shared history and structures of governance, including surveillance and control, as well as a very carefully constructed national language and culture. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but Putonghua is not actually a native language of any place in China. It's a constructed language. It's part of a project that began in the Qin Dynasty when an emperor couldn't understand his courtiers. And he said, oh my God, can we please unify the pronunciation at least? And they did so. They created Guanhua, Mandarin, and people were able to understand each other. It's a language based on the Beijing dialect. In about 1913, after the revolution that overthrew the Qing Dynasty, people met to decide what is going to be the national language. And at one point, a northerner punched a Shanghainese in the face because he misheard what the Shanghainese had said as a curse word, just proving the need for a national language. Anyway, Putonghua is now the constructed language, which is the national language of China. But in 2013, the Ministry of Education actually admitted that this is just 8 years ago, that Putonghua is spoken with native fluency by something like less than 10% of the population, and about 30% speak it almost not at all. So this is a really interesting thing. When you think about China and its diversity, this is a really, really interesting example. The People's Republic of China has so many different kinds of peoples, ethnicities, cultures, dialects, and languages. And you find every kind of person there. I once met a Tibetan yak herder. I met him in Beijing, which was the second city he had ever been to. His solo experience previous to that of a big city was the one trip he had made to Lhasa, and he had walked there. It had taken him a month. And then you've got people, East Coast urbanites, for whom the countryside is what passes outside the window of the 5-hour high-speed train from Beijing to Shanghai. In China, you'll find, like anywhere else in the world, you find people who live for money, you find people who live for love, for their children, their pets, their faith, their music, their art, for travel, or the fight for democracy and human rights. And people who, whether because of poverty, horrific labor conditions, and expensive healthcare, official corruption, callous policing, struggle to live full stop. China is an idea of a country. It's created from a deep history and long memory. And yet the People's Republic of China is a place where history is partially shuttered and where memory can be treated like a dangerous thing. But history tells us, and this history is not suppressed, that over thousands of years, China has not been one country. It is often broken up into warring states, and unification under a central government has very often been tentative and fragile. Now, the most famous unifier in Chinese history, and this is really important to the way I see China, and I think it's important to the way that, and the way I see China is also, I've learned to see China by reading in Chinese and listening to Chinese conversations about China. The most famous unifier in Chinese history, and this is quite important, was the first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huang, the guy with the terracotta warriors, if you need a cultural marker for that. He conquered his rival states in 221 BCE, and he ruled all under heaven by a combination of mass surveillance, militarized rule, unification of everything from the written language to the length of cartwheel axles, because that way you could have a system of roads in which carts could travel no matter where they were going to or coming from in the empire. They could fit in that same rut. He also had a policy of social control, summed up by the expression 焚书坑儒, which is to burn the books and bury the scholars. Now, it's worth pointing out here, because it's not always pointed out in China, that when people speak of Qin Shi Huang having unified China in 221 BCE, his empire, the Qin Empire, which gives us the name China, by the way, did not include Xinjiang, Tibet, the southwest of China, the northeast, or even a big chunk of the southeast, much less Taiwan. It was only thousands of years later, really, it was in the Qin Dynasty, which lasted from 1644 to 1911, that all of what is considered Chinese territory today became part of China. And Xinjiang, incidentally, was such a difficult conquest that the Qing had to conquer it twice. But it was the ancient Qin Empire is really important for how I see China today, because it gave all subsequent rulers a serious conundrum. They wanted to be unifiers, but was tyranny, the kind of tyranny that he exercised, burning the books and burying the scholars, was that a prerequisite for keeping the empire together? Would the center hold otherwise, or would all under heaven collapse into violent chaos of the sort that preceded the unification? This is constantly debated. Now, one of the books that Qin Shi Huang burned, or one of the thinkers whose books Qin Shi Huang demanded to be collected and burned, were those of the thinker Confucius. Luckily, some people managed to hide some copies. Confucius urged, to be very, very simplistic about his philosophy, he urged rulers to govern by moral example. And this is very different from the legalist philosophy adopted by the Qin, it's called legalism, where you govern not by moral example, but by setting rewards and punishments. Right and wrong don't exist except as something that the rulers want. So if a ruler wants this to happen, that's right. And you punish people for not doing it, you reward them for doing it. What I see today, the People's Republic of China, as a place where both the Communist Party and independent thinkers struggle with the legacy of the Qin, including its suppression of Confucianism and all of that sort of thing. Or perhaps it's the thinkers who struggle, and the CCP more enthusiastically embraces the legacy while also embracing Confucius, which is slightly confusing. But then again, many historical rulers paid lip service to Confucius while basing their rule on legalism. So that's how it's been for a very long time. So that's just to say that this multiverse also includes diverse political philosophies, or philosophies of governance. And there's others besides Confucianism and legalism. And Confucianism itself is a broad church and was always evolving, and various Confucians fought with other Confucians over what the proper way of governing a state through Confucianism actually meant. But even Chinese communism is today is not what it was in Mao's time, and it's not what it was in the late 1970s or the early 80s when Deng was launching his reform. So perhaps it's not so surprising that even the presumably most ideologically cohesive demographic in the People's Republic, the more than 91 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, do not, despite the best efforts of the party's disciplinarians, think or act as one. And how could they? I mean, some come from the peasantry and others from urban entrepreneurial classes. Some joined in the days of Mao, others during the reform era of Deng Xiaoping, and some, quite a few, in the 9 years since 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power. There's dissidents within the party. They get kicked out generally, and one Cai Xia is now in exile in the United States. She said that Xi Jinping had turned the party into a political zombie, and that 70% of the party disagreed with Xi. Who knows? I have no way of judging the credibility of her claim, but to take the words of the American poet Walt Whitlam, did I just say that? That's hilarious. Completely out of context. The party, like China itself, is large and contains multitudes. For a few short years in the 1980s, the multitudes contained by the Communist Party included the translator, drinker, literatus, wit, and bon vivant Yang Xianyi, the man with me in the photograph that was used to publicize this event, and an old friend of Jocelyn's as well, and probably some other people here. Yang Xianyi was the Oxford-educated son of an eminent Tianjin family. He joined the Communist underground with his English wife in the 1940s. They suffered horribly in the Cultural Revolution, but were rehabilitated in the Deng era. And he was the chief editor of Chinese literature in the Foreign Languages Press. I was introduced to them in 1981 by Jeremy Barmay. Xianyi smoked like a stack of chimneys, and he drank like a school of fish. And whenever I visited him, he'd pour me a glass this big of whiskey, and I'd be like, I can't drink that much. And he'd say, "Mama he, just drink it slowly." Now, in the 1980s, he actually joined the Communist Party. He became one of these multitudes. And his friends always joked that it was mainly for the mischievous delight of beginning every sentence with, "We in the Communist Party believe." After the violent suppression of student-led protests for democracy in 1989, Yang Xianyi no longer believed. He described the events as a fascist coup, that's his words, engineered by a few diehards against political reform. He told the BBC that the CCP was worse than the warlords, worse than the Japanese invaders of the 20th century. It was probably a little exaggeration, but it was a very emotional time. The party did relieve him of his membership, but they didn't detain him. The Communist Party wants to control the narrative about China. It doesn't care how I see China or how you see China. You have to see China the way China sees China. But there are 1.4 billion ways to see China. There are 1.4 billion Chinese stories. Xianyi's was just one. Just as he likes to begin his sentences with "we in the party believe," the Communist Party, with far more serious intent, likes to begin its sentences with "we Chinese believe." But it should be obvious by now that that's, not really a thing. Given the extensive control that the party exercises over media, culture, and education, the pervasiveness of its propaganda machinery, and its complement the apparatus of censorship, the party can at least appear to speak for all Chinese. But I think it's really important, it's always been important for me to understand that no one can speak for all Chinese. No one. And the Xi Jinping push for homogeneity, which is probably a bigger push for homogeneity in thought and everything else than we've seen ever probably. He even promotes the idea of a catch-all Chinese ethnicity. This comes from, the way I see it, a desire to vanquish the multiverse and its centrifugal force for once and for all. Finally, I see the PRC as a rising power that wants what it considers long overdue respect and rightful recognition. Aware of just how much the current rule-based order was designed to benefit the US, rather the US and global capitalism, Beijing, not unreasonably from its perspective, believes it's now its turn to write the rules. So why do I see China the way I do? 45 years of personal experience is the shortest version of that, plus study undergraduate degree in Asian history, and a lot of work on Chinese language. So I studied in Taiwan for 2 years under martial law at the end of the 70s, lived and worked in Hong Kong and China for the first part of the 80s. Most of that time as a journalist for Asia Week magazine, covering Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the mainland. And I lived in Beijing as Asia Week's bureau chief before the systematic harassment of my Chinese friends led me to quit. I visited Shenzhen, that great big city on the border with Hong Kong, when it was a construction site and a pile of blueprints. I've stayed with peasants in tiny villages, including one on the Sichuan-Hubei border, and I've visited millionaires in their weekend villas by the Great Wall. I've had my pocket picked in Chaozhou. I've been sexually harassed in a Beijing night market. I've exchanged confidences with strangers on long train journeys in second-class sleepers. I've had love affairs, danced at parties, and wept at funerals. My experiences and friendships in China are all part of why I see China the way I do. There are also, in addition to friendships, and one of the friendships I wrote a book about, which is that of with Ho De Jian, a singer-songwriter who wrote the song Long de Chuanren, the heirs of the dragon. And he offered me entrees into all kinds of worlds, crazy worlds, including that of Qigong masters and telepaths and fortune tellers, because he loved all that. Anyway, that's The Monkey and the Dragon tells that story. But I want to tell one more story, which is there's a lot of great random encounters that you can have in China. And they've also contributed to how I see that world. I've got a ton of stories, but only 35 minutes for this talk. So I'm going to just share one here. I've chosen it because it helps to illustrate how, however many times the Communist Party repeats its claim to speak for all Chinese, Chinese people insist on speaking for themselves. Now, this took place in 2006. I was at a very, very ordinary working class dumpling joint in Shanhaiguan, the city at the eastern end of the Great Wall. It was about 5:30 in the morning. I was there with the driver I'd hired to take me around for the day. I was doing some research for my novel, A Most Immoral Woman. And I'm pretty sure we were going to go watch the sunrise over the wall, because I can't think of any other reason that we were there at 5:30 in the morning. Anyway, when we walked in, the other diners looked up, stared for a second or two, and then went back to eating, except for one guy. And he'd been staring for a while with this funny little smile playing on his lips. And finally, he addressed my driver and he goes, 她对中国什么看法? What does she think of China? So my driver said, ask her, she speaks Chinese. So he did. Now the conversation pretty much commanded the attention of everyone in the room. And like, this wasn't really the time or place to go into my theories of the multiverse or reflections on the legacy of Qin Shi Huang or anything. So I answered politely and in very standard acceptable cliches that China was a great country, 地大物博, vast in territory and rich in resources, with a long history and a rich culture. The guy rolled his eyes. What do you think of the Chinese people? He then demanded. And now you could have heard a pin drop. So I thought, oh my God. So I dipped again into the fount of acceptable cliche. The Chinese people are kind, hardworking, generous, and hospitable. The guy rolled his eyes again. They almost went in the back of his head. And he said, 老外懂个屁, which means for you know nothing, foreigner, an expression you could semi-literally translate as you understand fart all. And he said, China is a mess and the Chinese are crooks, liars, and cheats. And then he went on a little bit. There was a moment of silence, and then the entire place burst out laughing. After which there was another little moment of silence, and everybody refocused on breakfast. So now none of these experiences and the other things I've been talking about, including the friendships, would have resonated or indeed have been accessible to me if I had not known Chinese. So it really is a big part of why I see China the way I do. It means that I can resist falling into that rabbit hole of news and analysis that reduces the Chinese multiverse to the Communist Party, politics and economics, as Jocelyn was, saying. This is like what you kind of tend to think if you're just reading the news. Language opens the window and lets the air in. Every day of my life, I thank Professor Lee Williams of Brown University, who insisted that I study Chinese over my ardent objection based on a dismal run-in with French in high school that I wasn't good at languages. And he told me that I would never get China if I didn't learn the language. And he was absolutely right. So there's experience, there's language, and there's history and culture. And we have not that much time, so I'm not going to go into all the things about history and culture and how they inform me, except to say that they are so important to my vision of China. Another thing which I'd like to mention why I see China the way I do is my ex-husband friend, Jeremy Barmé, who introduced me to Yang Xianyi and to many other extraordinary people, including the Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo, when Liu Xiaobo was just a cantankerous cultural critic. Jeremy has been for some 40 years now the most extraordinary of mentors to me, forever alerting and sensitizing me to historical and literary resonances in contemporary Chinese politics and discourse and bullshit as well. So from that, what should Australia's approach to China be? Oh, little topic here. Now, I've been talking a lot about language, but there's another point about language, and it really doesn't require learning Chinese. It requires paying attention to something that Confucius said. How can you have a lecture about China if you don't quote Confucius at least once? A disciple once asked Confucius, what would be the first thing that you would do if you were running a country? And he said, rectify the names. And the disciple's like, what? And he said, if the names are not correct, if they do not match realities, and he went on a bit, human affairs disintegrate and their management becomes pointless and impossible. So you have to speak precisely, is basically what he's saying. You know, you can't faff about. You can't be Scott Morrison, did I say that? So here's my suggestion. Australian politicians and others need to stop talking about China and the Chinese when what they mean is the leadership of the People's Republic of China or the Communist Party. They should name those things if they're criticizing them, because criticisms of the policies and actions of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China can sound a lot like racist statements when they appear to be directed at the Chinese themselves. And a general rule of thumb is, if something sounds racist, it is racist. And we have a real problem with racism in this country. Anti-Chinese racism is one thing which has really gone a bit crazy over the last year. Now, last year, Senator Erica Betts interrogated several Chinese Australians in a kind of a McCarthy-esque way. I was thinking about McCarthy in America. They were testifying to the Senate about issues facing diaspora communities, and he demanded that they express condemnation of the Communist Party in terms that satisfied him. And this is, or should be, a textbook example of what the Australian government should not be doing. You know, because it's so, it makes the entire Chinese Australian community feel like they're up in the dock, that if they don't express condemnation of human rights or the Chinese Communist Party or whatever in terms that satisfy the most right wing of politicians, then they will never be considered Australian. And that is a terrible, terrible impression to have given. You know, if first generation immigrants are happy about the way the Chinese Communist Party is running China, then they should be free to say so. I mean, whether Erica Betts likes it or not, just as those who criticize it must also be absolutely free to express their opinions, and equally free not to speak, whether it's to protect their family members back home or for whatever reason. All of us, if we, you know, this has to be something, and I despair that this government will ever get this in their head, but all of us, if we are not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, are settlers here, whatever our race, country of origin, or the number of generations that our ancestors have been in this country. And settler Australians should be allowed to keep whatever sentimental attachments they want to the old country. And that even goes for Tony Abbott. To be clear, an attachment to the PRC doesn't justify any kind of criminal act on its behalf. It doesn't justify spying, actual spying, or violently attacking people demonstrating for Tibetan independence, because they have their right to their opinion as well. It doesn't include the ability or the right to mount campaigns of harassment against university lecturers for using maps that the PRC disapproves of. The Chinese Communist Party would like all of that to happen. Some people would like that to happen, but it must not be allowed to happen. You know, there's a difference between being able to express your opinion and being able to oppress other people from expressing theirs. The Chinese Communist Party does try to manipulate opinion in its own favor among Chinese diasporic communities. That's absolutely true. But if the government is worried about the undue influence of mainland controlled or sponsored media here, I have a very simple solution. Boost funding to SBS. Let them hire more Chinese language journalists who can cover Australian and Chinese Australian issues from a perspective that's neither Beijing's nor that of the Trumpist conspiracy promoting Falun Gong linked Epoch Times, which is kind of a mirror source of dangerously distorting mis and disinformation for Chinese language communities here. Why not boost SBS to be able to provide this service? It's so simple. The government should also draw on a greater range of advisors with more sophisticated understanding of China in all its complexity than it appears to be relying on at present. Some of those with undue influence today don't even have training in Chinese language or history. All of their knowledge is mediated, translated, secondhand. They get it from reading English language things and speaking to their Chinese informants. The PRC has its wolf warriors. We have our China hawks. Wolves versus hawks. How is that ever going to end well? The government needs urgently to establish special advisory task forces on issues such as Taiwan, especially Taiwan, in fact, because this is likely to be a major flashpoint. There's all kinds of indications that China may be ready to move on Taiwan at some point. I don't know when. Defense analysts have all different ideas on this. But what we need is those defense analysts plus Chinese specialists, including historians, maritime historians and others, to be there workshopping various scenarios and Australia's potential responses to potential scenarios and Australia's best responses to those scenarios. The government, I think, should sponsor university-based translation projects that would make available a huge range of public discourse from China on topics of import to Australia. It needs to stop defunding the universities. Chinese studies, Asian studies, like all the humanities, are becoming dangerously under-resourced. This is so, so dangerous for Australia. We need to train more people, not less, in Chinese history, in other languages, in Asian history, politics, and culture, and all the rest. One friend, I don't know if he's here, in Chinese studies at Sydney Uni told me that he might not be able to make it today because there was a farewell a little earlier for no less than 4 of his colleagues today. That's a disgrace. Not that he couldn't come, that they were forced to take redundancy. Another thing, I believe that whatever tensions and problems exist between our two countries, Australia and Australians must also continue to engage on a number of levels, obviously diplomatically, economically as much as we can, culturally, and across the many, many channels, both public and private and semi-private, that have been established or have arisen organically over the near half-century since the normalization of relations under Gough Whitlam. That's the Whitlam. There are many critics of engagement. Engagement, and I mean, you know, engagement, some people like Clive Hamilton will call it an equivalent of appeasement. You know, it makes my head explode. Engagement can be a somewhat fuzzy concept, and certainly in the past, and in terms of American engagement with China in particular, there have been fuzzy or wrong-headed goals attached to the idea of engagement, including that of changing China, regime change. These things have been attached to the idea of engagement from time to time. So I say yes to engagement, but yes to overhauling and rectifying the name of engagement. Let's be clear about what we're talking about, what we want from it, and we don't want regime change. There's no evidence that disengagement, by the way, would benefit Australia, or even how it would work in this interconnected world. Australia must never sign up to any American program of regime change. Have I said that enough? And the Australian government needs to make crystal clear, including to Beijing and to Washington that whatever else the alliance with the US means, or for that matter, the Quad that we're forming with Japan, the US, and India, these will never mean trying to overthrow the Communist Party. That's not our business. If China is to change, it must be the Chinese who change it. And that's not the same as endorsing the Communist Party, agreeing with its policies, or refraining from criticism, including of its human rights violations in Xinjiang or elsewhere, or issues pertaining to trade. But that's just how it has to be. We are not to go in there or think that we're going in there or align with any mission to go in there and change China. And now I come to my final point, and this is something, because we talk about what Australia should do. And there's things that Australia can do and things that Australia can't do. For my money, if there's one thing that we need to change here to protect Australia from foreign interference from the People's Republic of China or any other country, it is to clamp down on corruption. Australian politics today is more polymorphously corrupt and infinitely less transparent than at any time in recent memory. I still recall when I immigrated here, there was a cabinet minister in Bob Hawke's government who fell from office for failing to declare a Paddington bear in his wife's luggage on return from a trip to the UK. That's accountability. Today, we have a government that blithely tolerates and protects the self-dealers, the pork barrelers, and is beholden to corporate donor interests that we don't even know about because we can't, because our laws don't provide for that. The coalition has, over the course of years in power, systematically weakened instruments and institutions of oversight, including our Freedom of Information regime, the ANO, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, while blocking all efforts to establish a federal ICAC with a broad remit and teeth. Both parties need to commit to fighting corruption, promoting transparency, and fully funding an empowered independent ABC whose journalists can follow their nose to whatever smells in our body politic without fear or favor. We need to establish a system of rapid reporting on political donations, or even better, ban private and corporate donations entirely. What does all this have to do with China? As I wrote in Australian Foreign Affairs, without radical transparency combined with strict accountability, we will never know who our politicians are meeting with, or who might be pulling their strings, and who might be pulling the strings of the string pullers. Australia's sovereignty is at stake, and unless we enact far-reaching reforms, the government is culpable of its endangerment. And Beijing will just sit back and enjoy the show. Thank you very much.